Hey friends, this is Joseph Maynor. So what I want to do in this week's video is I want to do an enlightenment contemplation exercise. And this is something that I got from actualize.org. And what I want to do is I want to do like a steel man of this actually, or just a enlightenment contemplation exercise so that we can see kind of how this can be approached for each individual person. Because I take the point of view that your spiritual teacher, whoever that was, the best they could be for you is an influence. At some point, you're going to realize, I can take it from here, right? But somebody who introduces you to something and gives you the first few kind of steps, is obviously appreciated, right? You can look at any kind of art form that you've participated in and see how this works, whether it's chess, whether it's cooking, spiritual enlightenment, your job, your hobbies, whatever they were. You can look back and you can appreciate, oh yeah, man, but for this person entering my life and giving me this information, I wouldn't have had it. Or maybe I would have discovered it later, right? And then you realize too, there was some point where I had to kick away the teacher, right? And kind of look at things on my own too. So without further ado, this video is going to be about contemplating spiritual enlightenment with an example. So I did this once before, actually, with a dialogue that I had with somebody on actuality of being. This one I'm going to do a little differently. This was not a dialogue. This was just a post. And I actually appreciate people who make a post a succinct post about something, because then we have some food, right? Food for thought, as we might say. So this post comes from a user named Breaking the Wall, and I'll post the link below that shows the actual thread, so that you can review it yourself. But let's go through this. First of all, realize that you're dealing with the writing. You're dealing with writing. You're dealing with language now. I don't know who Breaking the Wall is. I mean, it could be a man, it could be a woman, it could be, I don't know who it is. I assume it's a man because I followed him for years now. But I could be wrong there, right? Because I don't see any way to know. But it kind of doesn't matter, right? For this exercise, like, let's try to steel man what's happening here. So the text is, anyway, about enlightenment. About enlightenment. Do you even know what enlightenment is? Right. Did you have to learn what enlightenment is, like culturally? Or did you know it prior to? In other words, like, is it something that you learned? Or is it something that was natural that happened? So yeah, just a question. So, quote, here they say enlightenment is realizing that the self isn't real, or that you are God, or that you are infinite love. Here they say enlightenment is realizing. So it's a realization that the self isn't real, or that you are God, or that you are infinite love. You, right? Those are just realizations of the ego. Wow, there's a twist right there. Notice this. Those are just realizations of the ego. Namely, realizing that the self isn't real, that you are God, or that you are infinite love. Those are just realizations of the ego, are just realizations of the ego. So now we see a duality between the ego and enlightenment. We might say the ego versus enlightenment, right? That's a duality. Now, this isn't always going to be admitted by people, but I'm saying, like, I'm trying to steelman this, and I'm also trying to be, like, diplomatic and polite. But as I've said in my videos, transcending the duality between the ego versus enlightenment is actually one of the keys to love, developing love, or integrating love. Love with a capital L, not your human love. So keep going. Now the ego is the protagonist, right? So the ego knows that the self isn't real, the small self. The ego knows that the small self isn't real. Good for that ego. Is it the small self or the big self that the ego doesn't, or the ego knows that isn't real? The ego knows that the self isn't real. Good for that ego. I'm not sure I understand what's happening here, actually, honestly. If we interpret this as the ego knows that the small self isn't real, good for that ego, I think that makes the most sense. So this means that, like, your ego can see through itself and realize that it's not the self and that it's not real. And that's good for that ego. It's like the ego, like, found out its own corruption or something like that, and then it discovered that it's not an ego. That's an interpretation of mine, by the way, just so we know. But enlightenment is being the direct substance of unfiltered reality. So here's a definition of enlightenment. Enlightenment is being the direct substance of unfiltered reality. This isn't very uncommon, actually. I mean, this is what you hear in Advaita Vedanta, even Neo-Advaita to a certain degree. Enlightenment is being the direct substance of unfiltered reality. So I guess the filtered reality would be ego, and unfiltered reality would be something that's contrasted. So again, we see this duality between the ego versus enlightenment. So enlightenment is being the direct substance of unfiltered reality. So there's this idea that there's something that's filtering reality. That's not a substance, that you're not being. So you're wrong, right? You're starting out wrong. There's something wrong with the way that you're thinking or feeling or being. Enlightenment is proposed to be some kind of a change in being, namely the direct substance of unfiltered reality. So there's like an impurity presupposed here. It's like you're in Plato's cave. You gotta, do something to get out of Plato's cave and to get into reality. This is a very deep presupposition. Kind of reminds me of like Christians thinking that everybody is born evil. Well, you're born deluded, right? In Hinduism. Enlightenment is being the direct substance of unfiltered reality. So there's a process of change that's presupposed here that you must undergo to become enlightened, is the presupposition. All right. And then being one with the dance of existence and letting yourself be permeated by its vitality. The dance of existence. I like that, actually. I use that in my stages of beauty and creation. I love that metaphor, the dance of existence. Being one with. Okay, one. You know, this seems to basically being kind of explaining both masculine and feminine truth in one sentence, and I'll explain this here. So where he says, but enlightenment is being the direct substance of unfiltered reality, that's very masculine. We might call that consciousness. Being one with the dance of existence and letting yourself be permeated by its vitality sounds very feminine to me. All right. Being one with, that's very feminine. Being one with, everything is one. The dance of existence, that's very feminine. Letting yourself be permeated by its vitality, that's very feminine too. So he's expressing both the masculine angle and a feminine angle in my interpretation with regard to spiritual enlightenment. I call these masculine truth and feminine truth, respectively. Okay, so keep going. Now he proposes a certain ethic here, where he says, be open, without limits in heart and mind, flowing without resistance. Be open, without limits in heart and mind, flowing without resistance. All right, so openness is obviously a cliche for spiritual enlightenment, but then you kind of ask yourself, like, how many of these people are actually, really open? Without limits in heart, that's feminine. Okay, heart is feminine. And without limits in mind, that's masculine. Limits in heart, limits in mind. What does that mean? Flowing without resistance. So what I'm seeing here is that there is a kind of dissociative recommendation here that one should flow without resistance, be open without heart or mind, which are seen as limitations. And this is actually very, if you look at Advaita Vedanta, if you look at Shankara, or Indian philosophy with regard to Hinduism, this fits it pretty well. I mean, the idea that consciousness, really is not about body, heart, or mind. I mean, if you understand, we'll talk about this when he brings up Sat Chit and Ananda. But ultimately, this is Indian philosophy, the ultimate reality, and Hindu philosophy, right? That's the topic. So be open. That's a moral proclamation. Without limits in heart and mind. So somehow the heart and the mind are seen as limits. Flowing without resistance. What does that mean, though? Flowing... Do you flow without resistance in your everyday life? This sounds a little bit like a fantasy to me. I mean, I have to say, I'm not, judging anybody here, but I'm just saying, like, who really flows without resistance? Have you met such a person? Okay, friends, so we're halfway through the video. I'm going to come back and we're going to do exactly the final half of this. So just give me 1 second. Hey, friends, welcome back. So what I want to do in this video, or in this second half of this video rather, is continue on with reviewing Breaking the Walls post from actualize.org, and I'll post the link below so that you guys can look at it yourself. So in the first half of this video, we covered the first half of his post. The second half of this video, we're going to cover the second half. Now, keep in mind, this is just coming from my perspective. Like, at the end of the day, all I can be for you is like a model. I'm perfectly aware that I'm creating in this video, and that this post is actually a creation. So, but, people who are at the truth phase or the love phase, they may not necessarily see this to the degree that, unfortunately or fortunately for you, I can. So, let's go back to the prior sentence here. Be open, without limits in heart and mind, flowing with resistance, without ego. So somehow the ego is put in the shadow, right? Again, the ego versus enlightenment, duality. So there's something wrong with the ego, right, in this account. Breaking down the separation between the observer and the observed. That's a pretty common cliche in Advaita Vedanta. And not even. Actually goes beyond Advaita Vedanta, because actually, let me strike that. I was wrong there. This really doesn't go to Advaita Vedanta, because Advaita Vedanta would say that the observed is Maya, or ignorance, or an illusion. So this is deeper than Advaita Vedanta. This actually is something that I've supported, right? The non-duality between the finite and the infinite perspective. So all of a sudden he shifts into the, it's so funny, he says without ego, and then he shifts into this like totally different sentence, right? So breaking down the separation between observer and observed. Well, what's the separation between the observed, the observer and the observed? Well, consciousness and experience in Advaita Vedanta. Experience is seen to be an illusion. Consciousness is seen to be real. This is a very profound sentence here. Yeah, right. So breaking down the separation between the observer and the observed, I will argue, though, that ego goes to the observed, and that the ego should not be put into the shadow. There should not be a duality between the ego and enlightenment. The ego versus enlightenment, all right? Now, some of you may not agree with me, and that's fine. Like, I want to, get along with everybody, right? So I'm not doing this to try to, pitch certain people as good or certain people as bad. So his next sentence is, then, being pierced by the ultimate nature of what you are, of reality, and to be one with it. To be pierced. Who is being pierced? Who is being one with it? This is obviously a sentence. It's a statement. It's a thought, right? Being pierced by the ultimate nature of what you are, by reality, and to be one with it. But isn't this a memory? It's the past, right? I'm going to explain why. It's the past being promulgated through language into the future. So language is able to take the past and push it into the future. So for example, I've done a lot of psychedelics. I've done almost every psychedelic, right? Except for like the research chemicals, but I've done salvia, 5-MeO-DMT, NN-DMT, mushrooms, LSD, salvia before it was cool, right? So I've done a lot of these, and what these psychedelics do for those of you guys who like don't do psychedelics or can't do psychedelics is they give you a perspective that you may not have in the sober state or even in the sleep state or the dream state, although there's analogs there. So I don't want you to think just because you haven't done psychedelics that you can't be spiritually enlightened. No. I've done all the psychedelics, so I know what they are and what they're not. The reality is that you come down from a psychedelic, and because of the fact that you come down from a psychedelic, the experience you had cannot really be captured in language, because that's what happens when you start coming down. And then after that, you like preserve something doctrinally in language, and then you like form that as part of your spirituality. You become a camper, and you start teaching other people instead of continuing to do the work. I get it. Like we're all, we all should register that one, right? So thus, being pierced by the ultimate nature of who you are, of reality, and to be one with it. That's a moral proclamation at the end, to be one with it. How many people do this, though? After you come down from your trip or from your Hindu philosophy trip or whatever it is, right? How many people do become one with it? How many people do integrate that, right? That's absolute love. So he's talking about that, to be one with it. But how many people actually live that? Then he mentions Sat Chit Ananda. So Sat Chit Ananda is ultimate reality in Hindu philosophy. Friends, I'm going to take a break. I'll come back and we'll continue on. Just give me 1 second. All right, friends, I'm back. So Sat Chit Ananda means existence, consciousness, bliss. And these are part of what Hindu philosophy considers to be the ultimate nature of reality. And Sat is often thought of as existence. Chit is often thought of as consciousness, and Ananda is often thought of as bliss. But bliss people interpret bliss to mean, sort of like happiness or love or something like that. But actually in Advaita Vedanta, bliss is considered more like peace. It's not about human feeling. It's about peace with the masculine truth, which is the ultimate nature of reality. And to be one with it would be to be one with the ultimate nature of reality. Now, the problem with this is all Indian philosophy. But it does have a pointer. So, for example, if you do 5-MeO DMT, you might discover that you are consciousness instead of the small self, right? That you've basically been your whole life. But this is just a state, right? This isn't how it always is. So whatever truth is, it has to be how it always is. Otherwise, it's a fantasy. You can make an argument that it's a fantasy, even if it's not, right? Somebody can make an argument that you are a tribe that's basically believing in a fantasy, right? Be careful with truth. Like once you start posturing that you are the truth or that you have the truth is going to be your undoing, right? All right. That which is shining in its glory. That which is shining in its glory. That which is. What if that which is shining in its glory goes against your ego, right? What happens then? The absolute limitless in its abysmal opening. The absolute limitness in its abysmal opening. So with this, what I see going on here is kind of a combination it's a little bit of a combination of Advaita Vedanta and Zen, right? Because we're talking about abysmal opening or nothingness almost. The absolute limitless. But this is just words. Okay, first of all, okay. So the absolute limitless. Who's the absolute limitless? And its abysmal opening, right? That sounds like nothingness. I am nothingness, although I still have an ego. I still show up as some guy with like long hair and a beard who's like really whacked out, right? He's like making YouTube videos. But that, to be one with that which is shining in its glory, the absolute limitless in its abysmal opening. Also, notice how religious this sounds too. One of the things I want to show you guys is just how religious a lot of these people are, even though they denounce religion. There's just a religious aspect to Indian philosophy. There is nothing else to know. It's the fundamental, the being that is, and that is everything. Okay. So how does this change how you operate in your world or in your life? There is nothing else to know. Can you say that with a straight face? I mean, I was like, okay, yeah. It's like I had this trip and I had this experience of myself as God or whatever. 10 years later, I'm still here operating as a human, fighting with other people, you know, stating an opinion, claiming to know. There is nothing else to know. This sounds like an ideal to me. It's like a thought that you're clinging to. The fact of being is always everything. The fact of being is always everything. That sounds like feminine truth. But of course, just 1 second after that, I was open to it. But of course, hold on. Wait, so this is interesting. Just 1 second after that, I was open to it. I'm close to it. There's a empty feeling appears. All right. So there's a lot of mixing going on here between different things. But of course, to who though? To you, right? Your ego. Just 1 second after that. Why does time matter if we're talking about the absolute? I was open to it. I'm close to it. To what? This philosophy that you've proposed here? I'm close to it. Then an empty feeling appears. All right, so what's happening here is he's mixing Advaita Vedanta with Zen. He's giving you the lingo, the story, and then he's taking it back. Right. Now I'm close to it. Then the empty feeling appears. Of course, because all this is a thought story. For people who are hung up on this for whatever reason. I know, who knows, that I thought there was no knowledge here. Hold on, let me see. Be open without limits in heart and mind, flowing without resistance, without ego. But then we get the statement, I know. Right. Don't be ashamed of you or that you know, right? I mean, this is something I've tried to point out many, many times. So I know that the absolute emptiness, alive, blah, blah, blah. Okay, this doesn't even make sense, but I'm going to try to be charitable and make it make sense. I know that the absolute emptiness, alive, blah, blah, blah. See, what you're doing here is you're combining Zen Buddhism with Advaita Vedanta. So, or actually, what you're doing is criticizing Advaita Vedanta, the absolute emptiness, alive, blah, blah, blah. So again, this is why it's like I'm trying to steelman this. This actually is kind of a meta statement, right? But it's criticizing, it's critical though. Instead of realizing too that like even this story is a story too. But who knows that? It is the ego. If the ego is here, the door is closed. This right here is the conclusion, right? But who knows that? But who wrote this? Who knows this? It is ego. If the ego is here, the door is closed. But who is operating without ego? Who has the open door that is operating without ego? I mean, the closest that you can get to this would be absolute love. Not emptiness, not truth, right? Although, what emptiness is, like at the highest level, like for example, Zen, emptiness comes when you realize the limitations of not only truth, but feminine love. So now you can be in a stage where, or a state where you kind of, the happy Buddha who's kind of laughing at everybody, right? But that's not done defensively. It's done because you realize that all these egos have stories, and that's not going to constitute enlightenment, including your story of truth. All right, friends. So I want to thank Breaking the Wall for this post. I want to thank actualize.org for the source of this. And I just want to say, hopefully I, was respectful to him or her. I don't know who it is because it's just a image without a real name. But just going through this, I think, I always have a lot of respect for somebody who just like puts forward a very succinct account of something, and then I can analyze it. So, all right, friends, hopefully this is a good video. I'll talk to you next week. Take care.